Good evening. It's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I am Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we'll bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV usually doesn't tell you. But with the appointment of best-selling novelist Nadine Dorries to Culture Secretary, another appointment after many, and with the public recantation on BBC Question Time by Andrew Neil of his involvement in GB News, and the launch of a new TalkTV station by Rupert Murdoch, tonight we'll be looking at media and the culture wars.
We'll also be looking at new claims of BBC censorship with an exclusive interview with a businesswoman who claims that her critical views about Brexit were removed. Now, to discuss all of this, we're joined by our Byline Times writer, Otto English, who always looks like a giant when he sits next to me on the sofa, but has many interesting insights.
And the only way you can get Otto here and run this whole thing is thanks to you. No, we don't, like GB News, have a Dubai hedge fund. Nor do we have advertisers. What we have is you. You pay for all of this and you keep us honest. So if you can do it, and you want to join a Q&A after the show, what you can do is go to patreon.com/Byline TV and become a member, a sponsor, a producer. You can also do that on YouTube. We won't be joined by Otto, unfortunately, he has to speed off, but our producer, who's been up to Manchester, has some great stories to tell us to do. So do sign up and join us after the show. So, Andrew Neil. Well, that was an extraordinary moment last night. I'm not sure how many of our audience saw it, but just to relay it, well, let's see it in a moment. The founder of GB News has publicly resigned from it and publicly criticised it on his former channel, i.e. the BBC. Let's look at that clip, but can I just say, because we've done a lot of journalism on GB News, do we agree that GB News is a bit of a misnomer, i.e. it doesn't cover news, and it's not Great Britain, it's not GB. It's funded more than half owned overseas, and half its directors are foreign. But let's have a look at what Andrew Neil said last night.
Well, I had always made it clear it wouldn't be a British Fox News, and I think you could do something different without going anywhere near Fox. Fox deals in untruths, it deals in conspiracy theories, and it deals in fake news. And that's not my kind of journalism, and I would never have set out to do that.
Is that why you've left?
I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why I'm here tonight and not with GB News on that.
No, hang on, Andrew, you're not going to get off that lightly.
I wasn't expecting to.
No. So, this is your first appearance on anything other than GB News since you announced your resignation. Why have you quit?
In the run-up to the launch, through the launch, and in the aftermath of the launch, and I think most of you who know anything about it will know that you couldn't file the launch under startling success, more and more differences emerged between myself and the other senior managers and the board of GB News. And rather than these differences narrowing, they got wider and wider. And I felt it was best that if that's the route they wanted to take, then that's up to them. It's their money.
What was that route?
And well, the route is what I think is what you can see on GB News at the moment. People should make up their own minds as to whether that's what they want to watch. I thought it wasn't for me, and I had wanted a different route. Doesn't mean I'm right, they're wrong, but it certainly was a difference.
And is it because you felt they were going too far to the right?
I also spent the summer looking at all the work.
No, I'm asking, is it that you felt they were going too far to the right?
People should make up their own minds on that.
No, but we're just wondering why you've
What
left.
I've told you is that the differences were such that the direction they were going in was not the direction that I had outlined. It was not the direction that I had envisaged for the channel. But I was in minority of one.
Well, that's quite an extraordinary moment, at least for me personally. I mean, Andrew Neil, I think 8 years ago, a response to me criticising when climate change said bollocks, if I can say that on TV, and criticised my book on Murdoch. But so he's been a figure in my life ever since the 80s. He took over the Sunday Times from Harold Evans, one of my heroes, Sir Harry, and I think sort of took it a bit downhill. But then I was on TV with him. I was on Sunday Politics about the child abuse allegations and systematic. And he was very fair to me and gave me, I was being sort of harried by David Aranovich, and he gave me the last word. So there seems to be two sides of Andrew Neil. What's your impression, having seen that, Otto?
I mean, the thing is, he had a history of being extremely balanced in a lot of his programmes. And I didn't read the Sunday Times back when he was editing it because I was far too young. But watching his daily politics shows over the years, for all the criticism that has later and rightly been thrown at Andrew Neil, and for his sort of chumming up to a lot of the Leave type politicians and players during Brexit, I think he's been a fairly balanced figure when he's interviewed people. He's taken on figures from the right and shown a degree of balance. That clip last night is extraordinary because it's a man who's had the surfeit of self-confidence rug pulled, sorry to use the word rug in relation to Andrew Neil, but pulled from under his feet. He looked shaken and shocked, like he'd been pulled through a hedge, really, through a hedge fund. So yeah, I mean, he's wobbled. The mighty Andrew Neil wobbled, and that's the striking bit for me.
I mean, interesting enough, what people said, you know, what GB News showed, and he did an extensive interview with Rishi Sunak, but generally how much he was supported by the BBC. You know, I could tell, partly because the BBC's rules and what should be Ofcom rules, that he was, you know, forced to apply fairness, not on his Twitter feed, which is very unfair, particularly to the journalist Carol Cadwallader, and also had the backup of research. So he knew exactly the killer question to ask. What do you think, Hardeep?
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting how open he was. And so quickly after resigning from GB News, he appears on BBC Question Time, you know, their flagship politics show, and sort of sets out his stall that, you know, actually we were going in two different directions. And, you know, being quite clear that how GB News is now emerging, which is very anti-woke, dominated by Nigel Farage, to my understanding has editors behind the scenes which want to push the sort of divisive, sort of Fox News style element of things. Neil was saying, actually, that's not the kind of journalist I am. So I agree with Otto. There was a sort of vulnerability about him. And I think that the discussion which ensued was actually really important, because it struck me that how often do we ever have in public a discussion on prime time about our journalism and what's driving it. And I think it's that the insidiousness of the power structures that lie behind it that need to be exposed and talked about, and we never do that.
Exactly. There's that omerta. I started my journalism, you know, basically looking at phone hacking, and you know, people distance you. Never criticise any journalists. It's kind of like a trade secret.
So it's really interesting that Andrew Neil ends up being in a position
and
where
being held
he's
to account by
Yeah.
people on that platform. I mean, it was watchable Question Time, which I mean, a decade perhaps has passed. Bonnie Greer's famous taking on of the leader of the BNP, whenever that was. I mean, that was a very, it's a long time ago.
5-6 years ago.
But yeah, it was very watchable.
So here's another question that arises sometimes about the de-radicalisation work. You know, we work to have been, you know, phone hackers or on right wing. I'm being said, well, kudos for you, Andrew Neil, for owning that bit. I mean, there's other things I think he needs to own up to. He might one day apologise for saying bollocks to me when I point out the difference between weather and climate, but I don't really mind. Is that, you know, there are a lot of people who can't forgive him. You know, he has to have a full recantation. And we'll see. Let's look at this clip from Neil Zabby, I think it was, questioning him on Question Time about, you know, he did announce, Andrew Neil, for whatever reasons, advertising or being advised that way, a war on woke, which is basically, as far as I understand it, a war against people who don't like racism, you know, which is a weird thing to. Let's see how Neil was challenged by another member of the panel on Question Time last night.
GB News was set up, as it says over here in black and white, and a channel that was intended to not be quote-unquote woke. That it was going to be a channel that was going to fight the quote-unquote culture wars. I posited to you, Andrew, that you actually knew exactly what you guys were setting up. That you were setting up, when you used the term like woke as a pejorative, I put it to you that you knew exactly who that dog whistle, you exactly knew the dog you were blowing that whistle at.
So why am I not still there?
I think GB News, when it launched up, was actually a very, very shoddy platform or so. It came out, it was embarrassing to watch. To Beatrice, it's not going to be Fox News. It's not Fox News by any means. Fox News actually has very, very decent production values or so and very well thought through programming. GB News is by no means whatsoever Fox News. It's actually a very inferior product to almost anything on the market. But what we actually had, what GB News did represent is the exact same thing that Fox News represented, which was for the purpose of re-mainstreaming and maintaining almost a cocktail of bigotries.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. You know, he did declare war on woke and something about Britishness, Otto?
Yeah, I mean, when GB News launched, they made a big song and dance about how they were going to be essentially a patriotic news channel that was not ashamed to be proud to be British. I mean, it says it on the tin.
But
GB
even
News.
though it's like foreign owned.
GB News, yeah, even though it's foreign owned. But that was their USP, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We won't be ashamed to be British and to talk about how proud we are to be British. And they got all these people who've basically trotted out the same line on Twitter and elsewhere for decades. You know, the likes of Tom Harwood and the other ex-Guido Fawkes crew. So saying you're going to do patriotic news, that's not news. But how can it be news if you say we're going to basically do
What, you mean it's
patriotic news?
It's
propaganda.
propaganda.
It's the kind of thing that happens in North Korea or countries like that. And so Andrew Neil now rowing back and saying he didn't know what he was letting himself in for and had all his doubts. He was trotting out his...
putting the British back into BBC. He was criticising his old employer for 20 years.
And also the term woke, which I find increasingly annoying. You know, we're going to declare war on woke and all this kind of stuff. What does it even mean?
It's like the war on terror. How would you ever declare victory anyway?
But what does it mean, declaring war on woke? It's like on decency, on good values, on people who object to racism, on people who support the Black Lives Matter movement. Why are you going to declare war on that kind of thing? And it's tedious, and Andrew Neil really should have known better after all those years in journalism.
Which raises the question to both of you, really. One is, can Andrew Neil come back from this?
But he's clearly got the contacts, hasn't he?
Yeah. What do you think, Otto? You think he's going to be going back to his old employer, cap in hand?
Well, it was a bit telling that his first appearance was on the flagship BBC programme, wasn't it? I mean, I do wonder whether he will try and claw back some credibility that way. I mean,
very interestingly, by the way, out of the news this week, we've kind of forgotten in this melee of broadcast news. And by the way, we always cover media because we think in the information age it's kind of key part of it. He founded GB News back last year with Sir Robbie Gibb, his former producer on the Daily Politics and Westminster Politics. Who was caught trying to stop the appointment ahead of news of former Huffington Post editor and Newsnight producer Jess Plummer. In all this noise, she has got that job. And it makes me wonder if there's some kind of culture war change here in the BBC. He's come cap in hand, but he's defeated. I mean, I do think you should accept that people have retreated and harry them back to extinction. There is a major retreat there, surely.
And he was quite frank about it, wasn't he? And that clear. I mean, he was, which I think is admirable to some extent. I'm not saying
he pushed back against the questions. It was quite personal. You don't know me, which was weak to me.
But
that's on the issue that they fake news. You know, because we need a common reality, don't we, Hardeep? I mean, left or right. Back in the day, we'd still with Thatcher agree. You know, on climate change actually, but certain facts and figures. There were certain things which true. You didn't generally lie. Carrington resigned because he got didn't know the Falklands were going to be invaded. Leon Britton almost resigned over Westland. There was an acceptance then on left and right, and even further right than we have today, that there were common reality.
Neil comes from that generation of journalists, you know. And I think the other thing that's really striking that we always keep hearing in public life now, whether it's from politicians or prominent media figures, is what the British public wants to focus on. So
Right.
Boris Johnson often says, any question he's asked, which gets near to scrutinising some of his actions, he always says, well, I think the British public actually want us to do this. Andrew Neil, we're going to launch a channel because the British public wants, news that is going to tell them things that we shouldn't be afraid to say and discuss how we shouldn't be doing our country down. And I think here, the viewing figures for GB News have not been
Yes.
great. Some shows in the last couple of months been registering no views at all. There was a lot of controversy around one of the presenters taking the knee and subsequently
Matharu.
having to leave the station. So I
There's
think in a
something
way,
like that. There isn't a taste
yeah.
for it.
So
Even Farage's
it's
show,
reality.
which was meant to be the sort of cavalry riding to the rescue, that initially I think got 6-figure viewing figures in its first week, and then it's just spiralled down.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to listen to
But
Nigel
he's not a
Farage.
journalist. We know what he's going to
There's
say.
a collision between the culture war, which, as we will come on to this week, we've had Nadine Dorries appointed. Some have been joking, the culture war minister, to amp up
not a joke.
more of these divisions. And yet there's a collision with reality, as we saw in the summer with Euro 2020 and the footballers. Is there actually an appetite for just whipping up this sort of thing? The interesting question, though, I think, is because of the beleaguered state of GB News, I'm pretty sure Rupert Murdoch has seen an opportunity. Whether that will be borne out and more people will be attracted to another version of GB News, better produced on TalkTV.
So explain,
Will
yes,
be
TalkTV, having withdrawn from the idea of a Fox News about the same time GB News, a leaked memo from Rebecca Brooks, head of News UK, which is a subsidiary of News Corp, said it wasn't worth it. So it's cost them $4 million a year to do talk radio, which they obviously, $4 million, I think, cost them. They're not making that back. And $40 million to do a linear TV show. But they've now announced, with the return of Piers Morgan after 20 years to the Murdoch fold, there's a lot of story of Murdoch and Morgan, which we could maybe talk about. They are going to do that. Now, it's odd, isn't it? Because you'd think that the GB News experience would indicate them that that doesn't work.
But Piers Morgan is a big name.
Yeah.
So GB News doesn't have a name like that. Andrew Neil was the closest they got.
But it's got 1 million followers and Piers Morgan has 4 million.
Exactly. But Andrew Neil is also an old school journalist. Piers Morgan's a firecracker, isn't he? I'm
he's
not
a
sure
celebrity.
that's the right.
He's a celebrity columnist. That's how he began at The Sun. He's a celebrity.
He is very good at generating clicks and outrage because on his breakfast show, his little clips, almost every morning that Piers Morgan was on that breakfast show, Good Morning Britain, he would trend on Twitter and get the viewers in, even if it was only on social media.
Sometimes for holding government ministers to account.
He was very good.
Vilifying Meghan Markle.
Yeah,
So
he was very good at holding on the COVID crisis. I think constantly, and he even produced his own stats to say, I don't attack people of colour more than anybody else. The stats seem to prove quite the reverse. That he was quite often, and we had the case with a great tennis player, attacking her. But he is unpredictable, isn't he? Like on the Iraq War, he lost his job over a front page on the Mirror. It turned out to be false of soldiers abusing an Iraqi detainee. But on gun law, when he was at CNN, on COVID. So he plays a very clever contrarian game.
It was quite weather vainy, though, bringing enough people with him in the way the wind was blowing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was quite interesting when he was editor of the Mirror. There was the 1996 European Championships with the whole Achtung
Speed and
when they put a picture of an English player on the front page of the Mirror with a Tommy hat, and Morgan was very good at whipping up a mob.
Yes.
And
it's kind of pure populism that way, isn't it?
Pure populism,
and
yes.
becoming the news himself.
And becoming the news himself. And I reckon if GB News had got Piers Morgan on board, and I do wonder if they tried, but he was probably too expensive, or didn't want to touch it, more likely. They would probably have been quite successful If you'd put Piers Morgan on a breakfast show, for example, on GB News, you might have beaten the others in the ratings.
Peter, you're quite the Murdoch expert, having written 2 books on the man.
3.
Oh, 3, sorry. 3 books on Murdoch.
love facts, yeah.
What do you make, what are some of the sort of structural elements, the shifts perhaps that are going on? We've got Morgan back with Murdoch, and they're launching a television station. What do you think?
Well, papers are failing. The Sun used to be, the money earner. News International, as it was, based in Wapping, provided the cash because he had a monopoly position, more than 50% of the revenues to build Fox News. It now loses money, partly because decline of papers, partly because it's still paying out phone hacking and privacy intrusion settlements, as is the Mirror, for the time when Piers Morgan. So I was in charge. So, and if you look at what happened to the Southern Investigations, the private detective firm involved in the Daniel Morgan murder and cover-up, it worked for News of the World while Morgan was there. And when Morgan went over to the Mirror Group, it started working for them. So they both, I think, know where the bodies are buried. There's a kind of mutual assured destruction if they ever want to do it. And Murdoch tried this. He tried to take over Sky twice. Last time it was complete. First time he was delayed by phone hacking. Second time he backed off and it was sold to Comcast because he always wanted a Fox News UK. And I think this is kind of him and Rebecca, who's a very close friend of, I know from my correspondence with Piers Morgan during the phone hacking trial in DMs, they're still very close friends, and he was following that trial very intensely, especially when he was mentioned in court. So I don't think I'm betraying any confidences there. I've written about it. So I think that is a stab in the dark for them, because I don't know it's going to fly any more than GB News. It won't be as expensive. I think they'll be able to amalgamate his writing for the New York Post. It's going to appear on Fox News. It's going to be a columnist. So it's a kind of whole deal with Morgan at the centre of this thing. The advertising boycott would really hit GB News hard. I think it has hit the Sun and the Mail. So I think they won't bypass that easily, except they're doing special sort of embedded ads online. So I think it's very difficult to balance.
Talk radio is respectable-ish in a way. I'm just being honest. It's more it's respectable in a way that GB News could never be. So if they carry that through to TV, they're the sub-LBC, aren't they, really, talk radio?
I don't think they do brilliantly financially, but maybe it's not, Murdoch makes money.
He's got declining revenues in his newspapers, and that's a declining industry, and the Mail Online won the website wars, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's now winning the circulation wars.
And winning the circulation wars. Who is reading The Sun? I did look a few months ago, and figures were like around 1 million or less.
And a lot of giving away
their peak, they were on 4 million.
And they're losing 50 million a year.
Hugely influential, putting people into Downing Street.
The Sun won it.
Exactly.
Well, from GB News and TalkTV, we go to another broadcaster which has been back in the news and going viral this week. The BBC has caused controversy and claims of censorship. In an interview that they did with the businesswoman Mariella Gabutt, they've been accused of removing comments that she made critical of Brexit. Let's take a look at the original interview on the BBC, which aired live.
Everything that we're bringing in from abroad, which is a lot of the frozen goods, a lot of we import from Greece and Turkey, the bass and the bream. The price of a container pre-Brexit, because it's nothing to do with Brexit, pre-Brexit was £3,000 just over for one container. The same container containing the same goods cost £14,000 now. Massive jump. Of course, there's inflation.
And you have to absorb some of that price, but it never...
Later on in the day, the BBC again ran a piece on the same issue and reused the clip with Mariella Gabutt, but this time with her comments about Brexit missing.
Well, it's no wonder it's a hike in inflation. The import costs and the cost of bringing containers through is massive. The petrol has jumped diesel prices, so it's costing hundreds of pounds extra a week to transport the goods, and the public are the people that will suffer.
So that was quite striking. Very clear-cut case of, it appears, censorship, as people are saying.
But I think that there's a prevailing wind, which is that you don't mention the B word. Empty shelves in shops, don't mention the B word. It's rude to mention Brexit because it upsets people, because the B word.
B also stands for Boris Johnson.
It does. That's the B word that's acceptable. But the B word that is unacceptable is the one which is stopping us eating cabbages.
But is it acceptable? I mean, is it really interesting? I mean, back a couple of months ago, I asked the BBC what its editorial policy was on politicians who lie and how they report that, and they just they just said we won't be responding, which I thought was really, really interesting. So Boris Johnson, often covered on BBC News, but not his many misstatements, shall we say.
Well, to see what Mariella Gabutt has said herself, our producer, Caelan Robertson, went to Manchester for an exclusive interview.
A couple of days ago, BBC came down to try and get an interview for live TV, and I was very surprised by the reaction that I received. The price of a container pre-Brexit, because it's nothing to do with Brexit, pre-Brexit was £3,000 just over for one container. The same container containing the same goods cost £14,000 now. I didn't even realise, because I only watched the clip once, that they had cut it. And I do think it's wrong for them to cut it. It's just, this is important to me, and I think people should know the truth about Brexit, which is it's very damaging to this country, and it's only going to get worse. My great-great-grandfather started this business over 100 years ago with a wheelbarrow full of fish. And we continue 100 years later. People expect everything to be done and delivered to them, whereas... I'm sorry, it is on its way, but unfortunately we're really short of drivers, and everything's been delayed by an hour or so because we've had to divide the round out. I apologise, and it should be with you shortly. Thank you. Bye. That's the fourth today and it causes stress. These can't be sent. The fisherman that usually sends most of his stock, 70%, to Europe, can no longer do that because of the paperwork involved, so he has to sell his fish for a lot less, because we pay a lot less for the fish than the Spanish and the Italians. Sea bass, sea bream, and I would say most restaurants have sea bass on their menu. If there is an increase in problems, or they don't try and help with the paperwork, which is stopping this fish getting through and delaying it, it will come to a point where they will say, no more, we can't keep sending 100 grand's worth of fish, whatever, on a vehicle, to have it rejected because it's been sat for 4 days because the paperwork, it was blue instead of pink, or it wasn't filled in black biro instead of blue, or it had the wrong page on. We sell fish, we don't work with paperwork, we sell fish and we feed people. This is farmed bass. You won't be able to get this anymore, and that's tragic. Who hasn't had sardines in Portugal with a nice glass of sangria under an umbrella somewhere? Again, imported, or comes through the French market. It's going to get to the point where we can't afford to bring them through. It's very sad. Brexit is making it very, very difficult. The smaller the businesses won't survive this. And several restaurants have already gone under. Anchovies, my supplier has told me that. So he's having to pay an import charge from China and then from Denmark. So they will go up about £4 or £5 a tub, making them unaffordable for the customer. Disgraceful. So, two of my very big suppliers closed during COVID because the Brexit we could cope with, but the COVID polished them off. And that is, I cried. We bought off them for 25 years. They're not suppliers. I've got fish suppliers that their dads supplied my dad. You know, that's how personal this is to me. And people should know more than the newspapers say.
So those are the media wars, and underlying it, of course, and that's why you're here, Otto, because you're the expert on them, are the culture wars. Now, there is a new general in the culture wars. In fact, the Spectator was told by the government that Nadine Dorries, the new culture secretary, has been brought on board for her sort of militancy over the culture wars. In fact, there's a great tweet, which we might be able to see now, about snowflakes, pantomimes, cancel culture, and pulling down statues. Otto,
Yeah, she said that pantomimes were being dumbed down, didn't she? Yeah.
were they ever
I mean,
dumbed
there's-
up?
They were mummered up.
That's
Yeah,
true.
thank you very much. But there's, dumbing down is a very strange thing. I mean, I've been to a lot of pantomimes in the last decade. I've been to the Greenwich pantomimes. I've been to pantomimes out in the countryside with my children. And the idea that pantomimes are being dumbed down is bonkers and weird.
Or that this is a massive threat to the British way of life.
Or that this is a massive threat.
Oh,
to
no, it
life.
isn't.
Oh, yes, it is.
Oh, no, it isn't.
It's very odd. And Nadine Dorries has this strange parliamentary history, which I tried to dig into over the last day as I was waiting to come in. And the strange thing about Nadine Dorries is she doesn't seem to have done anything.
She was briefly a nurse, wasn't she, to give us some due?
Yes, but as a politician. So she's been a politician since 2005. So she signed up to all sorts of groups. So she's part of the Cornerstone group, which is the forerunner of the Common Sense group.
Which you wrote about
Which I wrote about this week. And the Cornerstone group, their motto is flags, faith and
Family?
Family, yeah. And
alliteration.
those are basically her cornerstones. So she's come out fighting many a time as a sort of defender of Christian values. She was opposed to same-sex marriage. She's a very right-wing figure, but she's never really done anything.
She was a junior health minister for a brief period.
Yeah.
But this, you know, we're completely seeing exploded now. There's a cuddly Boris Johnson, Mayor of London, representing kind of liberal values, quite tolerant about immigration. Every appointment, as far as I can see in this reshuffle, has been to increase the power of the right. Well, always has been. But my question, therefore, and I have a theory about this, so I won't give it away, but so how are these culture wars going? Hardeep, I mean, you've been kind of leading on this a lot, especially on the infamous Sewell report about racism in Britain, and the brilliant stuff you've written about, now avid football fan, about the Euros 2020, which happened in 2021. We saw, and I think you'd agree, they kind of lost that first match in the culture wars over football.
Yeah, I mean, as I was alluding to earlier, there's the culture wars that are going on, and we keep being told that the British public sort of want some discussion of flags and statues, and that for some reason this is important to their everyday lives. But then the reality of it is, in these sort of set pieces we've seen, Euro 2020, or even, you know, the campaign to support the lifeboats charity, or, you know, the demise of the seeming demise of GB News, you know, there are these sort of points of reality which perhaps suggest that this isn't something people are that interested in. Or
surely you want to be able to drink pints with a crown on it.
Yes.
I mean, a black passport and a pint. You know, how can you not be happy with that?
So the crown on the pint is an interesting one. First of all, I wonder how many people actually ever noticed that there was a crown on their pint in the first place.
Nigel Farage would, because he's always drinking them.
Nigel Farage would, because he's always drinking Rioja and then pretends he's drinking pints. But so in his photo, you know, the photo ops, I'm sure he noticed that the pint glass was missing the crown, except that it isn't, because I was myself drinking pints in the week and there were crowns on the pints in the coal hole in the Strand. So, and I think it's fairly well known that they kept the crown on it and could always keep the crown on it. What it's about, it's that what that protection is there for is to protect the consumer, to make sure you've got a full pint.
Oh, right, so you're not being
It's up to
short-measured.
Not being short-measured. That's all it is. And
if you had a litre, wouldn't that be even better? So you get even more.
so that's all it ever was.
Yeah.
That line was just formalised by the EU as an EU standard. But of course, it was a pint, which is of course a British imperial measurement and always has been. So the idea that we've been deprived of our pints, they couldn't fight that one because the evil EU did not impose litres and half litres on us. pints remained. So they pick a fight over a tiny crown, which is there anyway. It's on pint glasses.
But what about
ridiculous?
What
a ridiculous
about
thing.
Decimalisation? Or everything went wrong with decimalisation. Before then, you could leave your door open.
Yes.
You could buy. I remember you could buy.
The Crays were in and out with their old mum.
Yeah. You could buy halfpenny chews for a halfpenny.
So. You are many, many decades older than me, Peter, as has been established. I am old enough to remember the deep confusion of a 70s and early 80s childhood where both systems were in operation. And of course, they still are to some extent.
Yeah,
because most British people still give their height in feet and inches.
Or weight in pounds or stone, which the Americans
Or
don't
stone, and miles, of course, we still use. Gallons went, 20, 25 years ago. But most of those changes towards metrification predate the EEC. So the British Federation of British Industry, they were the people who kick-started it in '65 when Nigel Farage was just a few months old. So they approached the government, they said, we want metrification. The government at the time, which presumably would have been Wilson, because that's '65, they agreed to it, and yes, some of that stuff got wrapped up in EEC membership, but to the general good, because the old money, which I can't remember, and the old measurements were fiendishly complicated.
144p in a pound.
Yeah.
Imagine that. It's like
ridiculous.
Babylonian
Shillings,
numbers.
Yeah, shillings, guineas, the money, but also the measurements don't tally with the rest of Europe
or the world,
or even the US. So people say, "Oh, it's great because we'll now be able to, work more closely with the United States, where they still have an imperial measurement system," except that it's not the same imperial measurement system as ours.
It's really interesting, these instances that are emerging of new things that are wrong and need to be fixed or returned to what they once were. I think it's like a quite profound point. It was coming back to what we were saying about Piers Morgan and why has he been hired as the face of a new populist right-wing Fox News style channel? Because he creates the news himself. And I think there's like a parallel here with the culture war, that now you've had Brexit and now you've unleashed a politics in which division and polarisation is such a big part, rather than sort of the parties you vote for. It's the values you're fighting to the death for. It's you need to keep whipping that up in that type of politics. And you need to start creating problems and new potential challenges which need to be overcome in a symbolic and practical sense, when those things are not really issues. And it is in the same way, this creation of news by reaction and provocation, and this creation of these cultural flashpoints, measurements, for Christ's sake. It's not even sort of, these are not real problems.
No.
But both of these things are being manufactured in a sense, and I think as a cover for some of the real deeper problems which are going on.
So there are two things with Brexit. Number one, we were told, anybody who said, oh, this is an attempt to drag the country back to the 60s and 70s, we were told, no, actually, this is about engaging with the big wide world. Don't limit your horizons. This is a bold step forward. That's now been proven to be a bag of vegetables, basically. Thank goodness there are some available. But because the imperial thing, it just shows their true colours, doesn't it? You'd have to be well into your 50s or 60s to remember an era of imperial measurements like that. And it's all they've got.
Thank you for telling everybody that.
I'm sorry. And it's the same with blue passports. What they need is they need to say, look, we've got some Brexit wins, and that's all they've got. It's like going to a drinks party and the canapes come round and all they've got is some own brand sliced bread with some margarine on it. Yeah, you've been promised quail eggs and that's what you're getting.
But you're getting English bread, proper English bread, and probably
British margarine,
and not too much brown in it.
Yes,
and British margarine, and like your famous cracker. Which actually, people who missed this amazing moment of television history, Otto filmed a
British cracker.
A British cracker on a table, and it got more views than GB News that day, I think, or at least one of their
I think we were heading towards the weekend,
But also now that Brexit has happened, we have to have some Brexit wins, but it has definitively happened. That was the whole point, get Brexit done. So they have to show that it's been done. But then there's a vacuum of there aren't any more enemies. So you have to start looking for them, and they have to now be internal. It's the historians, the academics, the people, the young people who believe in social justice. It's the enemies within. And I think, that is really concerning, because at the same time, you've got a number of policy decisions which are, again, targeting some of the most vulnerable sections of our society, the universal credit cut, again, that's going to go through. All these things are happening, and yet what's appearing in our newspapers, on social media feeds, and all the noise is, wars about measurements and statues, and it's actually very dangerous.
Well, it's also the classic, Southern strategy used in the United States. We've talked about it before. I don't want to bore people. The economic interests of working class white voters in the southern states is to vote for Democrats. They used to, for the civil rights movement. But what Republicans figured out under Nixon initially, and Lee Atwater, who came up with the Southern strategy, was that if you make them fight over identity issues like guns, God, race, statues now, they will vote against their economic interests. So that's the interesting thing, isn't it, Hardeep? And both of you. Boris Johnson has kind of co-opted. Aaron Banks started it first. We're kind of working class right-wing movement. We'll look after our kind if they're, they're working class, but we'll look after left behind white people. And what have they done? What have they done in the last week? We have 20% cut on universal credit. We have a 10% rise on national insurance. I mean, it's only 1.4%, but overall it's a 10% rise. That taxes the poorest most of all. Meanwhile,
and the young.
And they're not taxing property or, capital gains or all the stuff that touches the rich. Meanwhile, we've got extraordinary bump in inflation, partly thanks to Brexit, partly thanks to the coronavirus, so the reality is that the culture wars is distracting while, look over there, look at this bright, shiny thing, and your world is getting flooded. So is this working?
Well, I think, again, that question remains to be seen. I think there have been some wins in the Euro 2020. As I said,
Sewer report. I think it's 4-0, by the way.
The race report and the demise of GB News. But we've still got TalkTV coming. We've got Nadine Dorries in place, which suggests that Boris Johnson, in the very least, is confident that these culture wars are having some political capital for him and is going to keep pushing them. Also, Priti Patel remains in her position as Home Secretary. There were some, rumours that actually he was going to demote her because she hadn't been delivering on her crackdown on sort of asylum. But she remains in position, and we know that she takes a very hardline approach to what she calls people smuggling.
Well, that's another example of trying to. I mean, it's like plate spinning. You kind of have to keep running around, distracting everybody by making it look like all the plates are still spinning. And Priti Patel's crazy. I mean, I compared it to the one of my favourite scenes in the Police Academy movie franchise. Police Academy 5, Miami Beach, which I'm sure is a favourite of yours, which ends with them all on jet skis rounding up the baddies.
Oh, right.
And
that's the jet ski
scene in the Police Academy series.
And what they're using to.
Well, it's pretty much. This is pretty politics, isn't it? It's plagiarising ideas from Police Academy 5.
Which is it one of Boris Johnson's favourite movies?
No, Dodgeball's his favourite movie, yeah.
And of course he wants to be the mayor in Jaws. Now, is this playing, before we get to actually what's happening in the polls and we did go and interview some people on the ground in Boris Johnson's constituency about what they thought about the government now. There's one other thing you've exposed this week on Byline Times is a little bit of the history battle. We're fascinated by the history battle. But Common Sense, a group.
So the Common Sense group is another one of these groups that gets set up by parliamentarians, and this one clearly has taken its lead from the ERG, the European Research Group.
But by the way, which was funded by us because...
all these groups are funded by us.
So this Common Sense is funded by us?
I'm pretty sure. I'm not going to say for certain, but they normally are funded by their own MPs
research
through
budgets,
research budgets. Yeah. So with the Common Sense Group, you've got its lead on from the Cornerstone Group. So it's the same people, same individuals, same ethos, which is very Christian-based. That was,
right.
And the Common Sense Group is all about taking back control of our history and our history. Because their history is apparently our history. It's like what you were saying earlier about this is what the British public want. All 66 million people are spoken for by the Conservative Party, despite half the country not actually voting. More than half the country. More than half the country did not vote for the Tories, and yet we have a Tory government because we have a very immature democracy in this country. But yes, so they want to look like they're speaking for us. They want to look like they are speaking for our history, which they are defining as our history, and our values, which they clearly see as Christian values, despite significantly more people having Netflix accounts than ever going near the doors of a church. I mean, you could say we have Netflix values in this country because more people are committed to their Netflix account.
Yeah, we're one of the most secular countries in Europe, and Europe is one of the most secular parts of the world. And so what else are they saying? They're big on, as per normal, on Churchill.
Yeah.
And what they...
So it's I mean, it's very woolly. You know, it's defending our values. But somebody at the launch of this group, an MP who went unnamed, told The Guardian that they saw this as a culture war battle and that themselves as a sort of unit of, like a Panzer division or a Churchill tank division in that front.
Their manifesto, by the way, was published in May, I think. They had a book, and it was used by the Telegraph. This is the manifesto on the war and woke. Back to an
extraordinary book. I mean, I wonder. I mean, I did read it in preparation of the article.
Things you do for Byline Times.
Some of the articles in there which were very brief, incredibly woolly and sort of anecdotal stories about people who had. And as one of the stories told in it, in one of the chapters, is an MP who met somebody on the campaign trail who tells him that his child used to play with a girl who lived next door, but now 3 men have moved in from Eastern Europe and the child no longer has anyone to play with in the street. I mean, it's such a bizarre...
very Nigel Farage.
Very Farage. I mean, heading in Enoch direction.
Yeah. Which Peter O'Brien, another person who writes for us, says that's what's happened. 50 years after he was booted out of the Conservative Party for his Rivers of Blood speech saying that, there could not be a sort of racially tolerant Britain. That's what's backing it. And so when they say they're speaking for Britain or speaking for the ordinary people, they mean they're speaking for the ordinary people who are either the very small number of people in this country who go to church or the very small number of people in this country who have racist opinions. Because I think that's where the conversation has to be brought back, because I do think that there is the silent majority in this country are people who have fairly liberal values, who vote for liberal parties. But because the left and centre are so fractured, those parties can't get their act together, and so you keep having Tory governments who claim to speak for them. Hardeep, maybe you know a bit more about this, but when the Enoch Powell wrote, when we had imperial weights and measures, had made his famous speech in Birmingham, the population, if you like, what we call black and minority ethnic population, was something like 2%. Now what is it? Or it's heading towards, in 2021, I think, 2011, it's something like 15% of the population had some non-English or non-grandparent who wasn't born here or were people of colour. Do we know the figures of that? Because it's a very different world from 1968.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, demographically, things have changed a huge amount. I mean, I think it's been really interesting, again. There was another example of this notion of British values, I think, this week with regards to, is it the BBC's programming, or that it should be British shows.
Oh, they should only commission. This is John Whittingdale, who has now left.
Because Nadine Dorries has come in. So
Russian
again, this was very interesting. The sort of examples were given.
Only Fools and Horses TV.
And Dad's Army and things like that.
Yes, I think it had to be that. So they did it. They did make a point of saying Derry Girls would still be made under that remit. So it had to be something that was British in character. But, you know, there's a lot of that kind of TV on already. It reminded me of the whole Quota Quickie Act of 1927-28, when there was a huge panic in Britain about American and foreign movies being shown. And the government brought in an act. It wasn't called the Quota Quickie Act, it was called the British Film Act or something. I think it was 1927, which declared that something like 10 to 20% of movies made in the UK would have to be British movies. There would have to be British movies shown in cinemas, 20%. And other countries have tried this. The French did it with music, and I think Italy did it as well, to protect their values. But you just ended up with a load of garbage being turned out so that they could meet the quota.
But what you were just very quickly, Peter, you were saying about demographic change. Yes, I mean, obviously our population in Britain has changed immensely, you know, it's very diverse. So definitely, you know, like Otto was saying, there is the silent majority who will have been sort of kind of seen that this has happened and is all very comfortable with it. I think what's sort of potentially quite dangerous, though, is, as you say, Enoch Powell was warning, wasn't he? He was warning people there'll be rivers of blood. There'll be a day when there'll be black people in this country. You have the whip hand over the white majority.
Waters the Tiber will foam with blood.
The point is now, because of this demographic change, there is now an argument for people of that ilk to say, well, it's happening now. It's happening. Look how much it's increased.
That's
weaponising
replacement.
So I think it's now moved on from a warning about the rivers of blood to come that, oh, no, we're getting closer. Yeah. And those on the right who seek to weaponise these anecdotes, that's potentially quite concerning,
well, as
I would
Paul
say.
Mason has said, they're actually heading towards the premise of the Great Replacement Theory and race war. That's what the problem is. It's like reading about Weimar Germany. I don't think they're far-right racists, the people doing this, the common sense group, but they're playing on that
Yes,
margin.
that's what I'm saying.
See, David Edgar's Destiny as well, the great 1970s play in which the Conservative Party sort of moves ever more rightward and kind of merges with the far-right movement. And, you know, with UKIP taking over, UKIP ethos has taken over what was once the broad church of the Conservative Party. Used to have very liberal, wet Tory MPs who were not that different. I say used to. 2 years ago, you had very liberal-minded Conservative MPs who would not have been out of place in the Lib Dems or even in the Labour Party. But now you've got this pro-Brexit. They all had to agree that they would be pro-Brexit. They all had to sign up to it. So basically, you've got a Conservative Party with a populist leader, which has morphed into a kind of UKIP-ish Tory party. And I think if you were a Conservative, you'd have to think, is that if you were a traditional Conservative, is that really the Conservative Party anymore, or is it UKIP with Boris Johnson in charge, who by the way would have joined any party that had advanced his career? He'd have joined the Socialist Workers' Party if he thought it would get him into Downing Street. I mean,
so the question is then, just a final question before we go, because I think this is a bigger thing we'll be facing, the decline of those old coalitions, because the Labour Party, the Conservative Party were coalitions, and something's happened that makes that more difficult. What do Boris Johnson's voters think about, really, you know, these culture wars? They're distracted by them and what he's doing to their life. So our film crew, went down to Uxbridge to ask random constituents in Boris Johnson's constituency what they thought of how the government was performing so far.
He's broken every promise, every single one of them. Promise, get in. You know, they say we won't raise taxes, won't raise this, won't raise that.
These tax increases.
That as well. That's going to kill all the lower working class. And as usual, the rich are going to be richer. So basically, I've already said I won't be voting him in next time, and the quicker he's out, the better.
He was all right until he started his antics recently, yeah. Not so keen now.
No?
Putting up with taxes and that, no. I think he's going to lose his place over that, yeah.
And did you vote for him in the election?
Yes, I did, yes.
We voted for him, thinking he'd do good for this country, and now look what he's doing, he's ruining the country.
So I own a small business, and sort of stuff that comes back comes from the Netherlands, France and Germany kind of thing. It's become so much more expensive. Everything's become so much more expensive. Anything coming that's out of England basically is just become ridiculously expensive. So I just thought he would do a lot better. And being sort of like a Tory MP and this being a constituency, I thought he would have done a little bit more better for businessmen and for small businesses. We can't pay the sort of taxes and stuff like that they're asking for as well. So,
do you mind me asking who you voted for in the last election?
Conservatives, yeah, Tories. So yeah, I thought they were going to do a lot better. That's what it was. So it's kind of a letdown, really.
So we're seeing a classic decline mid-term in Conservative support, even in Boris Johnson's own constituency. But this doesn't feel, to me, like a classic mid-term. Only yesterday, there was a mass of police and a mass of mainly young people dressed in black T-shirts going, "Save the children, save the children." And they denied they're anti-vaxxers, but they were anti-vaxxers. We're having this weird, strange phenomenon in our politics, which is breaking up the old coalitions, isn't it?
Yeah, and the world is joined up through, I know it's a cliche to bring it up, but the world is joined up through the internet. So bad ideas and good ideas pass like a virus around the world. And so the QAnon element, which that sounds very QAnon-y to me, I don't know what you saw, but that thing can, the borders, you can put all the borders you like up. As long as you've got the internet, those ideas will zoom around, and so yes, a more sort of globalised joining up of things. The Conservative Party desperately trying to cling on to those old values, the common sense group, the Christianity and all of that stuff. I can't see how they're going to win it, and you're right, I can see the Conservative Party fracturing.
I mean, that's really something that we're all should be looking out for, really, is this Conservative Party under Boris Johnson, this era is extremely different from, many of those people who are prominent. Their idol is Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. But the party today resembles something very different from what she led. And I think there are, already concerns, not only from sort of MPs in his own party, but sort of the right-wing conservative media, that Boris Johnson isn't a conservative. This sort of ramping up of the culture wars, going towards this UKIPification of the party, that is being seen. And I think what will be really interesting is whether this party decides to get rid of Johnson and go back to something more palatable and sensible, or some of the party decides it's time for us to branch off.
But who is there to take over, you see? Because he is, for all his many flaws,
he wins elections.
He is a populist guy who wins elections. And, people go, oh, maybe Liz Truss or Michael Gove could take over. Those people do not have the X factor that Boris Johnson has. And, who's waiting in the wings?
This is the classic political analysis. We're in a different world where we don't actually all agree the same truths. With these people marching outside my house, get a completely different news system. They probably don't watch BBC. They get it from InfoWars and things like that. And this is where I think the role of Byline TV is important. We are trying to be objective. We try to analyse things we're fairly partisan against lies and against racism, but otherwise we're open to new ways of thinking. And on that score, I'm glad Andrew Neil has disowned fake news. Even though I don't agree with them politically, that is a good sign. So we'll keep on fighting to represent you, to represent the truth when we can, to represent a kind of interesting diversity of opinion. But to be able to do that, we need your help. You fund us, you pay for our staff, you get us online. So do support us by going to Patreon/Byline TV, or going to YouTube, and then you can join us in about 10 minutes for a Q&A with our producer, Caelan Robertson, who's been travelling around the countryside looking at Brexit, knows all about the infodemic and disinformation. So come back and see us next week if you don't do that, And until then, goodbye.
Thanks for watching.